Hi, welcome to The Forum. My name is Sean O'Brien. The Forum is a program where we look at issues that come up in our life and in our culture, and then go to the Bible to find the answer for Christians. So today on the program, we've got evangelist Andy Bird.
Hi.
And filling in for Jeremy Bear from Refuge Church is Brian Sauvé. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And then from Roy Bible Church in Roy, Utah is Kenny Montano, back in the guest seat instead of the host chair this week.
Yes, I get to answer questions instead of ask them.
Well, thanks for filling in.
No problem.
All right, so the topic for today is looking at the historical Jesus. This is something that comes up in the news periodically, at least every year, probably around Easter time. This year we got a book from Bart Ehrman called How Jesus Became God. Last year was another book called Zealot, which is a lot of the same kind of stuff. And the argument's basically that either there was no Jesus, or that everything that Christians believe about Jesus was basically made up by the disciples, that it never really happened. So let's start off with some basic stuff. Should it matter to everyday Christians that the intellectual community is making these kind of arguments about Christianity? Should the everyday Christian be concerned at all? Andy?
You know, I think it should, and I have actually more of a personal account on this one, because growing up really kind of in an agnostic, almost atheistic format that I did, there was the ability to choose in my life what I wanted to believe in, although it wasn't really ubiquitously choosing. I was confronted by two different pastors, and so I'd spent my life on the other side, all the way up to my early 20s, where I really would take what the intellectual community would say, and I would latch on to it because it helped me live my life the way I wanted to. It helped me reinforce my belief that I was God at the time, right? And any atheist can say anything they want about that particular comment, but the reality is they buck against authority, and they don't want an authority over them. And so in that process, in trying to prove these two pastors wrong that confronted me about Jesus, I had to go and do the research. And the research is there from not only the intellectual community for, but the intellectual community against. And it wasn't actually until I came to John 10:30 through 10:33 where I was really confronted with the fact that it didn't really matter what they said against, because I didn't think that Jesus claimed to be God. And so it becomes important for the Christian to not only understand who Jesus is, but what he actually did and what he claimed. And so you add those things together, and it becomes an intellectual assent to facts, at the very least, for the Christian to have that understanding. So I think they should be involved. I think it is not only just a defense, but maybe even an offense thing, not an offensive thing, but an offense thing that we should go on to talk about these books that come out that deny, or the intellectual community that because everybody has an agenda. So if Kenny and I do some research, we have an agenda. We're believers. We know that what we believe is true for a number of reasons, and it's not just a heartfelt reason. It's because there's a logic that's associated to it, and the proof is there. And so we have an agenda. Bart Ehrman has an agenda. Christopher Hitchens had an agenda. Right? All these guys have had an agenda to try to disprove, because they want you to deny that existence. So I don't think that this is something we can stay out of. And I think that on top of that, I think that there's validation that to deny the New Testament as a historical work, with all the things that it's consistently proven time and time again that it is accurate, I think that it's I think you're denying intellectual honesty at that point in time, and I think people choose to do that just as much as they choose to do other things. So yes, the answer is yes, in a long way.
All right, so Brian, did you have anything to add?
Well, I was just on that same note. I think it's important to recognize that what we're talking about isn't simply the intellectual community, because this book, particularly by men like Bart Ehrman, they're not writing scholarly level articles. These are articles targeted at lay people. Mm-hmm. And that's why they've sold hundreds of thousands of copies, What we're really looking at and addressing is the way that the intellectual community is shaping popular understanding of New Testament studies. And what's really happening is that men like Bart Ehrman reach 20 times the audience that men like Craig Evans, William Lane Craig, Michael Licona, all these really just as credentialed authors, but they don't have as big of an audience because, Bart Ehrman can go on the Colbert Report and reach an audience of several million young people and shape their opinions. And so what we're really trying to do, I think as pastors, as a Christian community, is we need to equip lay people to be able to interact in an intellectually rigorous way with these arguments and not take them at face value, but be able to look at them on their own merits. And that's really what we're doing, is equipping the saints to deal with these kind of issues that will come up in popular level media.
Yeah. So one more background question before we actually jump into the apologetics of this. I'll throw this to you, Kenny. Does it really matter in Christianity if the New Testament is based in reality or not? Can Christianity just be a faith-based religion, or does it need to be a history-based religion?
Yeah, so this would be against people like John Dominic Crossan and others who are on the extreme liberal side of Christianity, of what's called Christianity. And they would say, yeah, does it really matter whether or not Jesus Christ was actually God? Or that he actually, is the virgin birth, the historicity of the virgin birth, really important? Or is it the idea? Does it matter whether Christ was actually raised from the dead? Or is that a helpful metaphor for us, to understand? And these are the same people that say, that the message of the New Testament is just about loving one another and that sort of thing. And the problem with it is it's vitally important, right? So much so that the Apostle Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament, says things like, if Jesus Christ was not raised from the dead, then we are worshiping in vain. Then we're fools. We've been duped, and we ought to just go out and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we're going to die. And so we're wasting our time when we're piteous fools. So even the Apostle Paul recognized that if Jesus Christ was not raised from the dead, that we have no basis for the New Testament. And then Jesus Christ, what he becomes, is either one of, C.S. Lewis's old lunatic, liar, or Lord, that Jesus Christ, who claimed to be God, prophesied about his own resurrection, that if that didn't actually happen, and that the disciples manufactured resurrection stuff, or the early Christian community manufactured this stuff, and then bought into it as a mass delusion, as some of these people say, then what we have is a first century Jesus who maybe taught you to love people, but also was either crazy or a liar. And that's not a Jesus that I don't think any of us would want to follow or point anybody else to following. So the historic claims of the New Testament are vitally important for us to believe. And what Christianity really is not just a therapeutic deism, this idea of loving one another and learning how to get over your problems and how to have a better life now or later. But what Christianity really is that we are sinners and we are at enmity with God. There's a giant gulf that we cannot bridge ourselves between us and a holy God, and we absolutely need a Redeemer from the outside to come in and save us, and that Redeemer is the Son of God, who became incarnate in the flesh in Jesus Christ, lived a perfect life, died a perfect death, and was raised, conquering sin and death in the grave on behalf of, vicariously for other people, on behalf of sinners. And if that's not true, then the essential message of Christianity, and not sort of the not to call them side benefits, but the other things that go along with it, the lessons about life that are there, but the very essential message of Christianity is gone. There's nothing left. And so this is the historicity of the New Testament, and Christians having a confidence in that is vitally important, I think, for the church to move forward and for us to be able to defend.
Absolutely. Can I add to that?
Sure.
I mean, it makes us. It would make us just like every other self-help book.
No.
Right? I mean, faith in nothing means nothing. Faith in an idea or a premise, those are good things. But if I have faith, I've always said this, but if I have faith that if I stand in front of a truck, it won't kill me, and I stand out on the freeway, the faith doesn't matter, because reality sets in. And so reality has to be, it has to be aligned with faith. Otherwise, you believe in the wrong thing. And believing in the wrong thing and understanding the personhood of Jesus in this case is vitally important. Because if you have a Jesus that does not align with the not only historical, and I mean truly historical, but the Jesus that he claims to be, then you really have belief in the wrong thing. And that poses eternal problems for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I just pooped out a little bit, but it's okay. It happens all the time. So this idea that Christianity needs to be grounded in reality is pretty integral to the faith, but it's not only that it needs to be grounded in reality, but that Christianity is actually the basis for all of reality when it comes down to it. And we, being Americans, we miss the distinction about why this is important, that it is grounded in reality, for those reasons that you were talking about, that it's not just a self-help thing, but that it needs to be a real, actual hope. If we were in a third world country where maybe Christians were persecuted, those ideas would be much more important. They would have no incentive at all to want to be involved with Christianity if this was not something that was real.
That's right.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into the meaty apologetic stuff. And we'll start with, did Jesus actually ever exist? Now, it seems a little silly sometimes to me to even make this argument. I mean, there's plenty of liberal scholars who totally concede the existence of a historical Jesus, you know, barring miracles and stuff like this. But I still hear this quite a bit. So, Brian, why don't you start us off?
Sure.
Jesus never really existed.
Yeah.
There's no evidence for that.
The interesting thing about that argument is the place that you typically find it shows a lot about its validity. The place where you typically find the argument from silence that Jesus didn't exist is on radical atheist forums, where you have men without any kind of scholarly credentials who have done most of their research in the comfort of their own pajamas on the internet, and they're reading other forums and interacting in that way, and then they make these arguments. You very rarely find a credentialed scholar, whether one who believes the core message of the New Testament or not, who would put forward that argument. Mm-hmm. Because honestly, it's laughable for a couple reasons. Number one, every effect has a cause. You know, that's the most basic principle in historical studies and evidential science. And so the effect of Christianity has to be explained by some cause. And it was, without a doubt, one of the most significant effects that we've seen in the entire history of mankind, where in a very pluralistic society, in Greco-Roman society in the first century, where there were thousands of different religious beliefs, all of a sudden, within a few decades, you have arisen this belief that the Jewish Messiah came and died for my sins and rose to new life. And all of a sudden it becomes not a Jewish thing, but a Greek thing, and a Roman thing, and a Gentile thing, where they're believing in droves that this is the case, and going to horrible deaths to defend it. And to the point where several centuries later, about half the population of these areas affirmed the truth of Christianity. And so really, you have to either say that it was wholly invented, which no serious scholar will defend because the apostles died horrible deaths to defend this, lost great positions of power, such as the Apostle Paul, lost everything for Christ on a worldly level because he believed, again, in the hope of the resurrection and the hope that the real Jesus that he claimed he encountered had for him. And so every effect needs a cause. Also, the idea typically comes when people reject the best historical accounts of Jesus and they just wholly discard them, and that's the New Testament, where they say, well, we need to find Jesus in secular history if we're going to believe him. Number one, you do find him in secular history, but I won't even focus on that. The reality is the New Testament is the single best affirmed and attested collection of ancient manuscripts from this period by a factor of 1,000. Right. You know, we're talking about huge gaps between things that are taken as sober history and the New Testament in terms of manuscript evidence. And even then, the histories of the time are so thinly held and so thinly kept in extant manuscripts that a lot of the times we have maybe 40 to 60% of what these ancient Greek historians actually wrote down that we know of. We're missing half their histories. And the ones we do have are preserved on the basis of a few manuscripts with a gap of hundreds to 1,000 years. And so it would be foolish from a historical perspective, from a scholarly perspective, to reject the historical narrative of the New Testament on the basis of a much less affirmed, much less solid historical basis. And so really it's just, even Bart Ehrman, I mean, he concedes that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that he was buried.
And he was baptized.
Yeah, that he was baptized, that he taught an eschatological, apocalyptic message with unheard of, unprecedented authority. You know, that his disciples thought that he did miracles, and that his disciples actually believed they encountered him after his death. Bart Ehrman concedes all of those points. And that should tell you something about how solid the evidence is that those things actually are historical fact.
Yeah, there's some pretty powerful arguments for that, but for the type of people that will just write off the New Testament out of hand, you know, it doesn't matter to them. But so what they're really be asking us to believe is that that there's a massive conspiracy theory, that the apostles just made somebody up and attributed superhuman powers to them, and somehow a fictional character caught on as something that changed the course of history. Is, I think, Kenny, conspiracy theory, is this reasonable at all?
It's not reasonable because, again, just tacking on to all the things that he was saying there, you have people like Josephus and others, other historians writing, you know, later, who aren't Christians, who are writing about, and they mention things about Jesus and the early Christians and some of the influence that happened in the first century as they're trying to get their minds around the history that they're writing. And here's Josephus, who's not a Christian at all, and he's writing sort of a Jewish history of what happened to the Jews, and that was an important thing that happened to them. And then you have, you know, of course, in Roman history, you have the history of trying to explain, well, how did Christianity eventually become the religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine and others? So you have people, even Roman historians, who try to trace that, and they have to acknowledge that. But going back to your question about, is a conspiracy even logical to think about? I mean, this would have to have been the greatest conspiracy in the history of the known world. Okay, so two things either happened: either there really was a person named Jesus of Nazareth who lived in the first century, and as you talked about, that even guys like Bart Ehrman mention and just say, yeah, it's clear that he did certain things, right? Even if they deny the supernatural aspects of who he was. Or you have to give credit to these disciples because they were the masterminds of the greatest hoax in the history of the world, right? That no one has been able close to pull off. And not only that, but they were willing to go to their deaths for it. Yeah. These things propagated.
And they were fishermen, so
right.
and tax collectors.
And they do things. I mean, you read the New Testament accounts and you read the interactions between the apostles. These are not the accounts of people who have it all together and who are putting themselves in the best light. I mean, Peter, if he's one of these guys that's involved in this, is he going to write a story about himself denying this very Lord 3 times? Are Peter and Paul going to write stories about 2 of the apostles fighting and arguing, and Paul calling out Peter on behalf of his falling back in with Judaizers in Antioch? And you know, there's just so many things in the New Testament that if you were manufacturing this thing, you would not do. You would not do, because they would be difficult. Wouldn't we have the same people talking about inconsistencies, that seeming inconsistencies in the New Testament, which of course as Christians we can understand and explain, but why would you even have something close to a seeming inconsistency in the New Testament if you were manufacturing it? Yeah. And not to mention, they had to get this done quick, because it wasn't like they saw Jesus being crucified like way out in advance. We even have their writings and declarations of the fact that they were surprised by it. And then they have weird eyewitnesses like women going to the tomb, who you wouldn't have used in the first century if you were manufacturing it. You would have wanted somebody of much more stature and authority in that day and time going to witness the resurrected Jesus. But no, the women are the first ones who go. And you have just so many things that don't make sense with a conspiracy theory, that it is almost, one of you said that, like, intellectually dishonest to say that a historical person named Jesus did not exist and did many of the things that the New Testament writes about.
Yeah. Okay, well, time's slipping away from us, so let's move on to the next one really quick, and we'll start with Andy. So then next we get over the issue of, was there a person named Jesus? And then it becomes, was this Jesus really God? Was he who Christianity claims he is, or was that part all manufactured later on? The Jews weren't expecting a Messiah who was also God. This has been mixed in with Greek philosophy, things like that. So Andy, you alluded a little bit to it before in John. Did Jesus claim to be God?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the most important questions people can ask themselves, because it leads to everything else that really comes from his teachings to the way he behaved to how we should believe. And the interesting thing, and I studied this extensively, is Jesus doesn't come right out. Kenny talked about the self-deprecating nature of the New Testament, meaning it's very transparent and exposed. The other interesting thing about the New Testament is Jesus didn't walk around going, I am God, I am God, I am God, all the time. No. There were these influential moments, and John 10:30 through 10:33 is one of the, I think, it was pivotal for me, so very, very crucial, where the Jews are stoning Jesus, and he said, for what? Why are you stoning me? And they say, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the New Testament, does, unlike other books of antiquity, is it really demonstrates that that the people around Jesus at the time perceived him to claim to be God. Mm-hmm. And he didn't just claim to be God because he went around saying, I am God, I am God, I am God. It's because he had the attributes and the nature and did the things that only God can do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what people have to wrestle with. And I think that they should go investigate, and they should go look at, because the historical Jesus does line up. And by the way, to add to your Jesus as a myth theory, that is... It's so low on even the intellectual poll. I mean, only guys like Dawkins and Hitchens would even ascribe to that thing, because that helps them sell more books. I mean, I'll throw it out there just like that. Other than that, most of the intellectual community, including Bart Ehrman, who I don't love, but at least is intellectually honest. So yes, not only did Jesus claim to be God, but the people around him perceived him to be God.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Brian? Is that the only passage we rely on for Jesus being God?
One of the things that Bart Ehrman does is he tries to remove the Gospel of John as a late forgery, and then say, we're going to confine ourselves to the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to try and prove the deity of Christ. And again, I think the most important thing you could focus on, and just speaking to Christians even, if you're interacting with someone who wants to know, did Jesus, maybe he claimed to be God, but is he God? Because I could say I'm God, and that doesn't mean a whole lot. The single thing that we need to focus on apologetically is the resurrection, which is the hallmark, the proof that Jesus gave. I am master over death. Mm-hmm. I lay my life down willingly, and I can take it back up again. We're not talking about like Old Testament revivification where people would be brought back to their original state of life. We're talking about, when Colossians says that he's the firstborn from the dead, he's the first fruits of the resurrection, Paul says. It's that he was the first person raised to immortality, glorified body, and we have such good historical evidence of this, that Jesus went to the cross, that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and that the tomb was empty, and that he appeared to, as Paul says, he gives lists, this apostle, and then 500 people at a time, and then to me as one untimely born. Those lines of evidence converge to validate not just the deity of Christ, but everything that he said. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm speaking to Christians, I would say, focus in on the resurrection of Christ. It appears in all the Gospels, and you can't remove it, no matter what you do, from the text of history. And so that to me is the single validation that I need. And there's a lot of other ones, but if I'm going to really focus on one thing, it's going to be the resurrection of Jesus.
Right, which was not something that Paul made up. This
No.
this predates Paul.
Right.
Paul's
He
not
said,
the
"I
architect of
received it."
Christianity. Yeah.
You can the earliest Christian message that we can trace is in 1 Corinthians 15, and even liberal scholars will say this arose within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion of Christ. We obviously believe sooner, but if a liberal scholar will say the idea that Jesus died on the cross, was buried, and was seen to be resurrected by his disciples and multiple groups of people, that should tell us a whole lot about the idea that Christianity invented the deity of Christ and the core gospel message decades afterward. Absolutely, historically absurd.
Yeah. Kenny, take about 2 minutes and tell us, how do we share the gospel with someone? You meet someone on an airplane, whatever. How do you share the gospel succinctly with somebody who has these kind of doubts about the historical Jesus? Where do you start?
What I say is, I think the best place to start is to ask them to say, you want to be intellectually honest, a phrase that we've used. Are you serious about really wanting to understand what truth is, what actually happened? And if you are, then apologetically, I think the best thing to do is to really say, then what you need to do is actually, have you read the Bible for yourself? Mm-hmm. That's a good place to start. Have you actually read the Bible for yourself? Have you read it for yourself? Have you read the Gospel of Matthew? Maybe they have questions about John. Well, let's go to Matthew. Have you read Matthew? Mm-hmm. And actually just take them and read the Bible with them, answering questions as you go. And then knowing some of the, I don't think you have to be an expert, as every Christian has to be an expert, but get to know the rebuttals, the basic rebuttals, because they're not hard to learn about things like the different theories of what happened at the cross and the resurrection, and the basic different theories that are out there, because there's not that many of them, and there are good answers for them. So get a good book. Read books about like Case for Christianity and things like that are helpful. But I think more than anything, let's take people back to the Bible and say, would you want to read the Bible for yourself? Come to it honestly and open, as opposed to the way these other guys are, which are just denying the supernatural nature of it at all, and saying, I don't believe it before I read it, but to say, come to it open and read what's there for yourself, and really read, does this sound like something people made up, or does it have the ring of authenticity to it? Mm-hmm. And then the best thing we can do is pray for them, mm-hmm. that God would open their blind eyes to see the truth of God's Word, and believe in the power of God's Word to transform people, and not the power of our intellectual arguments to transform people's lives.
You need to ask them, what does it mean to you if it's true?
Yeah, it means a lot. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope that gives you a lot of food for thought. There's a lot of resources out there to further this conversation. If you want to contact us, it's forumtv20@gmail.com, and you can get our videos at youtube.com/forumtv20. Thanks for watching.